and I'm very excited to introduce Bruce Bartlett. I'll be honest, when the opportunity to host this event came up, I immediately signed up, given, after the, let's say, unique experience of 2017. Here on the second day of the new year, I thought the title of Bruce's book bears some repeating. The Truth Matters. Bruce has worked for 2 presidential administrations. He is a frequent commentator, an economist, as well as a New York Times best-selling author. In his latest book, The Truth Matters, Bruce has written an accessible, easy-to-use guide that helps anyone fight the incredibly disturbing trend of untrustworthy sources that have captured the nation's attention, especially over the past 2 years. Bruce's book is already garnering praise. David K. Johnston, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, wrote, "Best of all, Bartlett's manual is so accessible and direct that anyone will benefit from it, from high school students to casual news consumers to professional journalists." So, without further ado, please help me in welcoming Bruce Bartlett to Politics and Prose.
Well, thanks for coming out. Can everybody hear? Is this okay? The genesis of this book is that I was not happy about the election results. I voted for the other candidate, and I was thinking a lot about why did this happen. And there's a lot of, I'm sure there must be a ton of Trump books, in the pipeline. I know my friend David Frum has one coming out, and I'm sure there's lots of others. But I was trying to answer the question, why did this happen? And it was quite clear that the media is a key source of the problem. And I thought about, what I could say about this, being that I'm not a professional journalist. I've never worked for a news organization. But I think precisely for that reason, I have a different perspective. And my idea was that people are going to have to work a little harder at getting the news. It used to be very, very easy during, the lives of many of the people in this room. I know you grew up, there were 3 evening news broadcasts, 30 minutes apiece. And the newspaper and magazine industries were very strong. If you subscribed to any major newspaper in any major city, you got a pretty good a summary of the news of the day. And if you watched the evening news, you were up to date. You knew pretty much what you needed to know to be a good citizen. Well, obviously that's not true anymore. There's so many news sources that it's become a cacophony. You just have so much news coming at you so quickly, so rapidly, so broadly that it's too easy to tune out. And I know I tune out personally a lot of stuff. My wife plays trivia, and sometimes we watch Jeopardy, and I'm continually amazed at the common knowledge that I don't have. So I'm kind of more into public policy and things of that sort. But over the years, I've learned, to deal with some of the problems in the media in my own way, and I thought I could explain some of these ideas to people based on an experience that's not necessarily the same as the average person, but more like the average person's experience than, say, a professional journalist. And so, for example, I've been the source for hundreds upon hundreds of stories, and I know how reporters ask questions when they're talking to a source, trying to get some information out of them. I know how things have changed from the days when you could leak a story to a reporter at 5 minutes to 5 in the evening and know that they had a hard 5 o'clock deadline, and they'd have to just stenographically take down what you gave them or else lose the story. Now, obviously, that's ridiculous today. You have an around-the-clock news cycle, and one of the things that's changed is that the balance of power has shifted from the reporters, from the news media, to the sources. The sources now have much, much more power than they used to have, and the most obvious example is Donald Trump, who has how many millions of Twitter followers does he have now? I don't know. Well, even the real ones, if you count, are well up into the millions, not counting the bots. And he has the ability to not only go around the news media, he can go around his own staff. I mean, I worked in the White House for Ronald Reagan, and the idea that Reagan would make a statement on some important policy matter without it being very thoroughly vetted by dozens of people in the White House and just blurt out some major change in policy, in the early morning hours, when most people are still asleep, it was absurd. He knew how to read a script, and he understood the importance of producers and directors and screenwriters, of which we had essentially the same setup in the White House. The chief of staff was the director, and the speechwriters were the screenwriters, and so on. And he knew how to read a good script, and that's frankly, I mean, a lot of people criticized him for this at the time. They thought he was being insubstantial. But, compared to the president we have today, it would be really nice to have a president who thought about things before he said them and, actually studied an issue before it became policy and allowed his staff to have some input because that's what they're there for, and so on. So anyway, I thought about writing this book, and I wanted to write something very, very short and simple. My model was a little book that I think most people are familiar with called Elements of Style. I'm sure you sell hundreds of copies a year, at least in this store. Terrific for anybody who's a writer. It's just a terrific little book because it reminds you of simple rules of grammar that people know but you forget. And God knows you read anybody's Twitter feed, including the president's, and you sometimes wonder whether anybody was ever taught the difference between Y-O-U-R and Y-O-U''re, and things of that sort that seem to be a very, very common mistake that people make. And so I thought I could write up some rules about being a good media consumer in the 21st century. When you have to work a little bit harder, you can't just read the daily newspaper and feel like you've got enough. Because for one thing, the newspapers, the media in general, have deteriorated enormously in quality, quite frankly. They don't have the depth of staff, the depth of reporting that they once had. It used to be that the media were gatekeepers, and, for example, when I first came to Washington in the 1970s, I was advised, concentrate on the New York Times. Find the reporter the chief economics reporter, whoever it was, and really befriend them, get to know them, get them to trust you. And they took their gatekeeper function, very, very seriously. And you would have to be thoroughly vetted by a reporter before you could tell them something and they would be inclined to believe it or rather than disbelieve it. And you had no choice. They understood that there was a bottleneck and that they controlled access. And this gave them a great deal of power that they used or tried to use judiciously. I remember one of the reporters that I dealt with a lot, who I still miss, is a guy named David Rosenbaum. Some of you may know he was killed rather tragically over in Georgetown some years ago, and he would quite often call me up and say, immediately, this is not for an article I'm writing. I'm not going to quote you anything like that. I just want to try to understand this issue from your point of view. And my point of view in those days, I was a conservative Republican. I now consider myself an independent. I have no desire to be a member of my former party. But and it was nice. You could have a chat with the guy, and eventually he would learn to see the world the way you saw it, and so that he would at least respect your point of view, even if he didn't necessarily agree with it. Today, you don't really have that. I mean, I still talk to a lot of reporters, but they're always on deadline. They need a little bit of your time, a very little bit of information, and so often you feel like they're just fishing for a particular quote to balance off maybe something that somebody else said. I remember once years ago, I was talking to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, and he kept basically asking me the same question over and over and over again. So I finally said, "What is it you're trying to get me to say?" And he told me, and I said, "Well, I agree with that. Just put quotation marks around it." Saved a lot of time, because a lot of times they don't. They're not looking for information so much as they're looking for you to say something in a particular way, because it just fits into the story of whatever it is they're trying to write about. I don't know. But anyway, one of the problems that I've noticed over the years is that when the cutbacks started, I'm not sure precisely when the news media began its serious contractions. Obviously, it's been going on for a long time. But unfortunately, what they tended to do is go around the newsroom and offer buyouts to the most senior people in the newsroom, because they were the ones who'd been there the longest through seniority, and because they were the best, they were the most highly paid. So if you were looking to cut payroll, getting rid of these guys who were close to retirement anyway, and it didn't probably take a great deal of inducement to get them to retire a little earlier than they'd planned. But one of the things that got lost is a lot of what goes on in learning how to be a reporter is very informal. You learn it in the newsroom from your peers, and especially from the older guys who've been around forever. And one of the most important things that they would teach you that I don't think they can teach in journalism school, maybe they can't even teach it in police academy, but is just how to tell when somebody's lying. Now, I admit I'm not terribly good at this, but there are people in this world who they just know. They can tell by the inflections in your voice and your body movement and various other things. They just have a gut instinct as to whether you're lying or not. And that's something that reporters really, really need today, because a lot of them seem to be, well, frankly, rather credulous. They just take at face value too many of the things that they're told. Now, part of it is deadline pressure. You don't have the luxury of knowing you've got a couple of hours or maybe even a couple of days to report a story and make sure it's all right, because these days you've got so many people breathing down your neck who are able to post in real time, literally 1 second, you're writing it, the next second people are reading it. And unfortunately, there's a race to the bottom in many ways of whoever is first is going to get perhaps the lion's share of the clicks, and the clicks is where the money is. And the people who take the time, even an hour or so, to report a story and make sure it makes sense, that it's true, they get left in the dust. I mean, we're right down the street, as most of you probably know, from one of the most ridiculous fake news stories of the 2016 news cycle, the Comet Pizza place, where Hillary Clinton was having sex with young children in the back room or something, and some crazy idiot, believed this to such an extent he came up here with guns, to try to rescue the children. I mean, it's absolutely insane what people are willing to believe. And I think part of it is too many reporters have adopted the convention that, well, it's okay to repeat a rumor because it's news. It's a fact that it is a rumor, you see. And so what they end up doing is, by reporting some of these stories, or seeming to report them, but without confirming them, they lend credence or credibility to some of the nuttier stuff that goes on in, the bowels of the internet. And I don't know what we do about that when people are so pressured to get stuff out quickly, to get it, and not worry quite so much as they used to have to worry about whether it was really, really right or not. And unfortunately, this has affected, our finest newspapers. The New York Times is really kind of a shadow of its former self in terms of its impact on the media. And it's doing pretty well by comparison to a lot of others. I mean, the Washington Post, God only knows where it would be if Jeff Bezos hadn't bought it as a little plaything, you know, to use his tiny fraction of his billions on. But it's not unusual in the history of journalism and the media for newspapers to be owned by rich people who, frankly, use them for, their own purposes. In Britain, they had a term called press barons, who owned the great newspapers of Fleet Street, and their whole thing was to make sure you were on the winning side of the party in the next election, because if your guy became prime minister, then you became a knight, or maybe even a lord, and so that was your payoff for siding with the party that won. Here, it's a little different, but not too terribly much. After all, I think it's not coincidental that one of the last living press barons of the old age is Rupert Murdoch, who, of course, owns many of the most powerful media in the United States, and unfortunately, he owns the one that Donald Trump gets, our president gets the vast bulk of his information from, and I just find this, just incredible. And of course, it's a two-way street. The president uses Fox as a weapon against his own political enemies. He's given, many times more interviews to Fox News than to all the other media combined. And he seems to be, feel no responsibility to transparency, to the media as a whole, or the public as a whole, to doing things like having a press conference. Does anybody remember the last Trump press conference? I don't. But I'm only 66 years old, so anyway. So anyway, I wrote this book, and I wrote down a lot of seemingly obvious things, but I was following the elements of style model that you do need to remind people of things that they already knew because it's faded, they've forgotten, it's in the back of their minds, and sometimes you need to be reminded of the simplest things. Like, for example, clicking on links. Now, everybody knows what a link, I think, sure everybody in this room does, but a surprisingly large number of people seemingly do not know what a link is. I know this because I'm always getting people, when I write something, they'll send me an email or something and say, where's your documentation for this? And I'd say, well, if you clicked on the link, you'd find the documentation. But on the other hand, I learned a few years ago that you have to be very careful about links, because I discovered that my editor was changing them. Now, very few writers I know, certainly I don't, go back and check all the links in something you already wrote to make sure that they're right. In this particular case, I had quoted then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on some point, and I provided a link that took you to the State Department website, to the page where the speech that I was quoting appeared. So it was, documentary evidence, a first, a primary source document. And then later I needed to find that quote again, so I went to my own article on the place where it was published and clicked it on, and it took me to some random article about Hillary Clinton from that same publication, you see, because their attitude was, we don't want people leaving our publication to go someplace else, even if it's the State Department. We want people to stay here. So they just picked some random article about Hillary Clinton and stuck that in where I had a link to this primary source document. And up until that, for all I know, they could have been doing that for years, because I never would have had any reason to check. It was just coincidence. But this gets me to a point, which is, many writers are very, very lackadaisical about using links. And there are some publications, for example, Reuters, will never include links in any of their articles, even to a primary source. And maybe they have the same attitude my editor had. But it really irritates me because I check a lot of links. I always want to know the documentation. I want to know where this information came from and whether it's from a quality source. In the old days, you check the footnote. You look at the bottom of the page, and there was your documentation. And even if you never checked the source, you could tell, okay, this is from a reputable publication, or you could see who the author is and say, okay, that's a reputable person, or something like that that would give you some confidence that the information you're reading was could be trusted. Obviously, nobody uses footnotes anymore. Academics hardly use them as much as they used to, and of course, but we have these links which theoretically provide that same purpose. Excuse me. But very, very often I will go to I'll click on a link and it will be to a secondary source. It won't even be to the original reporter who broke a story. I mean, it would take, some people have an idea, well, I don't like to link to publications that are behind a paywall or that require registration. I'd rather link to some public source that people will have no difficulty getting to. But that's not the way I think. I want to see, the documentary source, or at least the original source, news source, where this article appeared or this information appeared. And it appears to me that a great many reporters simply they're just too lazy. They just don't want to be bothered. Or maybe an editor, or for all I know, an intern just stuck this into their story, and the reporter didn't have anything to do with it. But I think that this is a terrible, terrible waste of an extremely valuable function, which is documentation, and I think that one of the reasons the media have lost a lot of credibility, and maybe a lot of readers, is because they have lost credibility. People just don't necessarily believe what they have to say. And I think that there's ways they could deal with this. For example, this has been a pet peeve of mine for many years. A reporter will go and do an interview with somebody, whoever, and then you get a couple of quotes, in the article that they have, chosen from this interview. But how do you know whether these statements were made or quoted accurately or in context, or what other information was obtained in the course of this interview that the reporter didn't think was important enough to bother mentioning? Well, why? It's very easy to convert, voice into text, and they could post the entire interviews. Now, every once in a while they will do this, and it's always very useful when they do. For example, last week the New York Times interviewed Donald Trump, and they did post the entire transcript. And what you oftentimes find is that they bury the lead, that there was really much more interesting information that was left out of the article than was included. And I don't understand why papers just don't post this stuff routinely. It's added value for the reader, and it would provide a very important service in terms of giving the reader confidence that this interview was not a gotcha interview, that the quotes are honest and in context and so on. And as we know, the president has been known to deny saying things that we have tape video of him saying. And so it's becoming even more important not to be able to document the things that are being said. Another thing I talk about in the book that I found really kind of surprising that so many people have commented on this to me, but I talk about libraries, which I think a lot of people have the idea that's just where you go to get books. And people, let's face it, no offense, but people are not quite as interested in books as they used to be. But one of the things that libraries have, public libraries, is online databases, where you can go on and have access to information that would be extremely costly if it was available at all through a Google search or something like that. Now, my familiarity is with the Fairfax County Library in Virginia, and I use that almost every single day. There are very valuable search engines for academic journals and for data of various kinds that is extremely valuable and I use quite often. And I think people's just literally don't know that these things are there because the libraries don't advertise them very much. Why, I don't know. But I did a little bit of a search around, and every state, not necessarily every local library, but every state has a state library, and they have many of these same databases. Some have even better ones. I discovered that if you're an alumnus of a university, in many cases you can have some access to the university's libraries databases. And again, you'll have access to publications that you wouldn't otherwise have, or ones that are too prohibitively expensive. For example, the Fairfax County Library gives me access to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Every issue of the Washington Post back to whenever, the 1800s, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications that you might like to be able to read, but you simply can't afford them. I mean, the New York Times costs me $15 a month. I can afford that, but a lot of people, that would be more than they could possibly afford. I know people are always complaining when I link to something on Twitter and they say, "Oh, that's to the New York Times," and I can't access that. I've already gotten my 5 free articles for the month or whatever the deal is. But they could get it for free through their library if they wanted to go to the trouble. There's a lot of other stuff that I could talk about that's in the book, but I tried to write something really genuinely for the average citizen that would teach them a little bit about some of the ways reporters think. For one, here's I have to mention this because it comes up so often. People always ask me, well, why do reporters seem to do this, what was commonly called he said, she said journalism? They say, why can't they go to the trouble of telling us what they think, or doing some reporting to be able to differentiate between two different sources that give two different answers to a question? A good example would be, you're a reporter covering Hillary Clinton's campaign, and she says something, or somebody on her staff says something, and maybe you agree with it, maybe you think it's completely wrong. But rather than do some reporting and analysis and say, okay, here's what I was told, I've looked into this, and this is what the truth is, they'll go to the Trump campaign and say, here's what Hillary Clinton just said, what is your response? And then you'll see Clinton said this, Trump said that, and that's all you get. He said, she said. And the reason is really very simple. It all has to do with access. You see, in the old days, the reporters had the power because the politicians had to go to them to get their message out. They had to go through the media, and the reporters were the gatekeepers and the editors. Now it's the other way around. The media need access. They need quotes. They need inside gossip. They need information from inside the White House, from inside a campaign. And the only way they can get it is if the person who's willing to give it to them trusts that it will be used exactly the way they want it used. And they will read the story the next day and say, was I quoted accurately? Did they put in some snide remark that would lead me to believe they are hostile to our agenda? And so the best way the reporter can protect himself is by just being stenographic. You just take down and report precisely what they say. And if you want to have some sort of analysis or somebody to contradict or fact check, you have to quote somebody else maybe saying what you're thinking, you see. And this was a role that I know I often played with various reporters. I could tell they were calling me because to say what I knew they were thinking but could not put into their own words, because they weren't allowed to interject themselves or seem to interject themselves into the story. And so the balance of power has very much changed to the detriment, I think, of truth. Now, what publications have done to deal with this problem is they've created fact-checking sites. And the Washington Post site is run by one of their oldest and most experienced reporters, a guy named Glenn Kessler. But there are many other organizations and groups that do this PolitiFact and various things like this. And what they will do is they will then subsequently look at some of these stories, evaluate them, subject them to analysis and data and so on and so forth, and they will render a judgment that, oh, what this candidate said the other day is just a rank lie, or maybe it's a little white lie, or maybe they were just bending the truth a little bit, or whatever it is they do. But the problem with that is fact checking, to my mind, is journalism. It's not a separate branch of the media that's over here in its own little ghetto by itself. It's integral to every single thing that is written in a newspaper or reported on television. Fact checking is journalism. If you're not doing fact checking, what are you doing? You know? And so, I mean, we can look up official statements, you know, from the White House and other places and read what they have to say. We don't need a third party to download that information for us and tell us what was said. Maybe in the old days you did. I mean, the reason you had White House correspondents is because they would issue press releases and they'd only have a few dozen copies, and you'd have to get one to know what the president was saying, and you'd have to report it for your readers. But of course now everybody can download that information for themselves. They don't need the intermediary. Yet a lot of what the people in the White House do is they just sit around waiting for handouts. You know, it's really a kind of a criminal waste of resources in a time when resources are scarce. But anyway, I've talked on a little longer than I intended to, and I do want to take some questions. And as we said, you need to go to the microphones. I don't think you necessarily have to introduce yourself, but feel free to do so if you'd like.
So this is really more about your transition from a conservative Republican to an independent.
Yes.
So what happened to the Republican wing of the Reagan wing of the Republican Party? And do you feel like a lot of your political associates agree with you?
Well, I don't have nearly enough time to answer that question. Perhaps I'll write a book about it someday. But you know, you know, as my wife always says, you know, she didn't leave the Republican Party left her. I was very comfortable working for Ronald Reagan. I felt that the Reagan wing of the party is perhaps more conservative than I am today, but I never thought it was irresponsible. I thought Reagan was a good president. I think he was very much underrated by his enemies. And now that we've seen the people who have come after him, I think there's probably a lot of people on the left who have greater appreciation for Reagan than they did at the time. But he was a serious, responsible person, and you know, maybe they have them here in this store. But there's some books that were edited by Annalise Anderson and Martin Anderson, and a woman named Skinner, whose name I don't remember her first name. But anyway, they went into the Reagan library and found, during the time between when he was governor and the time he started running for president, he did radio shows, and he would just read a little script. It wasn't like a call-in show. And he wrote syndicated newspaper columns, and they found the drafts of these speeches or these radio scripts and the columns that he wrote all by his lonesome self. He had no research assistants or anything, in his own hand on, you know, legal paper, and with notes in it about where he got the information. He was very, very well read and knew an enormous amount about public policy, quite apart from his time as governor. And I just think, you know, it would be really nice if we had somebody like that, you know, as president again. So I don't know. I can't say anything more without going down a path that will take too long.
Hi, Phil Gale. I'm a journalist, so I appreciate getting your thoughts as a source behind a lot of journalists. Comment and a quick question, if I could. I guess I take a lot of your things that he said, she said, a lot of things I really appreciate what you said, I think are needed. The one thing I would stress is that journalists is not a monolithic group. All newspapers, magazines are not alike, as you know. All journalists on the same organization are not alike. The deadline pressures. Could you talk about, with that belief, that what journalism out there do you look to? What is good? I guess what I would say is that there are journalists out there today who are not on a deadline every 20 seconds. Great ProPublica is a thing,
Yeah.
a nonprofit that does large investigative stories that run in media all over the country, and they give it away for free. The impact of journalists, the Washington Post. Look at the impact they had on the Alabama Senate race. So you don't think the Washington Post is necessary? Look who won the Senate race. Obviously, there was a little bit of impact from some journalism there. You question about is it impacting the administration? Ask Tom Price, the former health HHS secretary, what impact journalism have in always seeking truth. So with that in mind, what areas of journalism do you look at as there is some good out there? It's not all just chasing.
Well, one of the things that I do is I've tried to, one of the things I talk about in the book is kind of creating your own newspaper. And you can do this very easily through something called an RSS reader, which was kind of around a few years ago, and now people seem to have forgotten about it. But it's an extraordinarily useful tool. I use one called Feedly, F-E-E-D-L-Y, Feedly. And what you do is you put in sources that interest you. For example, you don't have to get everything that comes from the New York Times. You can just get only the stories about the economy or only the stories about politics or whatever, and it's brought to you directly. You don't have to go to the Times homepage to look and see what's new here. I already read that story. Is this one new? I can't tell, blah, blah, blah. This way, the minute it's posted, it's sent to the reader, and you can find out something that when it's available, the minute it becomes available. And so what you can do is you can kind of create your own virtual newspaper by saying, well, instead of reading the New York Times' political coverage, I'll read Politicos, and that gives me my politics. Maybe I prefer the Wall Street Journal's economic coverage, so I'll get that. And so you can put together bits and pieces of publications out there that maybe you don't like in general, but do like some aspect of. And of course, you can do it for any number of things, not just the sort of things that we're talking about today, sports, cooking, entertainment, gossip, whatever. You can put together your own little newspaper. And similarly with Twitter, which I use quite a lot, say there's some publication that you generally don't like for some reason, say the Washington Post, but there's this one reporter there that you really like that reporter. You subscribe to her Twitter feed, and what you'll not only find out everything that she has written, because reporters are very, they always repost their own stuff first and foremost, but they will also post things that they think are interesting that perhaps they have vetted themselves, so that you can trust the reporter that you trust to send you to another story, another reporter's work that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise seen, that will then come to your attention. So you can have a whole list of reporters or commentators that you particularly like and just have them all in your Twitter feed, and that way you can get stuff from the people you have grown to trust. I think of it as similar to a movie reviewer. You don't want to go to a movie and not enjoy yourself, but over time you learn a certain reviewer has the same tastes you have. And if they say this is a good movie, I really liked it, then I'll go see it, and more than likely I'll be satisfied. And it's the same thing with reportage on any number of other subjects that you learn to trust and learn to use the material that this person has vetted and curated and chosen to call to your attention. And so I think between Twitter and an RSS reader, you can create a virtual news source for yourself that exactly suits your interests with only sources that you feel comfortable trusting. Pete?
I'm Pete Davis. Bruce and I worked together as economists on Capitol Hill and formulated the Reagan tax cuts. And you made a very important point. Distinction between primary sources, data, documentation, secondary sources, and just fabrications.
Right.
And so when you came to me and said, gee, let's do this tax cut, I had an actual computer model with real tax returns on it, and we kicked it around and came up with real data and how much it would cost and who would be affected and so on. Well, now try to find things on the White House website. Look at the budget cuts for the IRS statistics of income. Look at the budget cuts. We may have a failed census. Could you elaborate on how important it is to have real data?
Well, I was asked, what sources I rely upon, and one reason I don't use the media in some ways, the way I used to, is because I do go to the primary sources. The Bureau of Labor Statistics website is still very good. You might as well go there to find out the unemployment rate. Why read a news report about it? There's really no need to do that. And of course, the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Federal Reserve and so on. But you're right about the deteriorating quality of government data sources. I mean, there was a study on the Treasury website, as you know, that they got rid of because it flatly contradicted the administration's line on who benefits from corporate tax cuts. The Treasury's own economists had done a study saying, 17% of the benefits of a corporate tax cut end up going to workers. And they said, well, we don't agree with that, even though our own people did this and it was based on, as you say, real data from tax returns and so on. So they just deep-sixed it. Of course, it had already been published in an academic journal, so it wasn't lost. But it's stupid from them to do this sort of thing. And you're right about the census. It's something that worries me a great deal. I don't know what to do about that. I have some familiarity with data sources in foreign countries like China, where sometimes you have to find your own data. For example, in China, the GDP numbers were so unreliable that economists were going to the power companies to find out how much electricity they were creating in a given month, and using that as a kind of proxy for the manufacturing sector. And so if a lot of electricity was being used, maybe manufacturing was doing well and so on. And I think, unfortunately, economists are probably going to have to do a lot more of that in the future. I don't know what else to say.
Hi. I wanted to first thank you for your advocacy for just media literacy in general. Don't throw things, but I'm in the social media space. I got in really early on and was a huge advocate. Now I curse it, especially often when it comes to media. And so when you were talking a lot about, I thought a lot of the things you said today applied to kind of reading established media and some of the different things to know of when you're reading that. But I think there's a big difference between journalism seen today, online, social media. You have established places that have editorial processes they go through, and then you have online where anybody can start a website, abc.com.co, try to look like ABC, start another name, or hyper-partisan sites that have no editorial process. And unfortunately, in this last election, the months leading up to the election, that type of news, that like actual fake news, that's funny to say that, outperformed more established sources. And so I think there's this line of like media literacy and holding established media organizations accountable, but there's also, when you need to cut sugar, you don't go shoot heroin, right? And so, like, is there any advice that you have for in a day of helping people understand the difference between some of these sources and how to consume that, and then some of the other kind of legitimately fake or super hyper-partisan sources?
Well, it's interesting you bring up the social media, because there was a very interesting study out just today that was referenced in the New York Times, where some political scientists had looked at the spread of fake news through social media, and they found that Facebook was the biggest problem area, and they also found that if you talk to people in social media or in the tech industry, they think, well, we'll just come up with a fix, some kind of software thing, whatever. Well, Facebook tried to do that. They came up with a way you could flag stories in your news feed that you thought were fake news, and they would, I guess, investigate them somehow or other and make a determination. They'll put a little tag or something on the story, so if other people saw it, they would see this has been deemed to be fake news. What it turned out is people read those stories even more than they did before they started flagging
Yeah,
them.
there's a-
And unfortunately, this is relates to other phenomena that I've read in the psychological literature and elsewhere, where they've sat down with people to try to talk to them about fake news stories that for some reason or other they believe, and they discovered that in the process of refuting them, they came to believe them even more. Now, what do you do when you've lost the ability to use logic and evidence in support of your position? You're just adrift without a compass. I don't know what to do about that. I have some hope that it's a generational problem, that some of the old people, that is to say, people older than me, the threshold for being old, it rises. You know. But I think there's a lot of unsophisticated people out there. One would hope younger people are more sophisticated. They can tell the difference. But I haven't seen any actual data to
Yeah.
confirm that. I just don't know. You know, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that the various tools that help spread fake news can stop it. For example, when you come across a story that sounds, oh boy, this is really interesting, I'm going to click this on. Well, you know, if you can just get people to slow down for a few seconds and go to Google News or search, you know, some aspect of that story to see if anybody else is talking about it. Now, you know, it might be the very first report, okay? And maybe, you know, you lose a few seconds telling your friends about it, but more often than not, you're going to protect yourself from spreading a lie that's very, very hard to take back. Some of you may have seen the other day, who was it, Jenna Fisher, is that her name? She used to be on The Office, an actress. Anyway, she posted something on Twitter that turned out to be not true, and she wrote a nice little response the next day apologizing for doing so. But I mean, how many people do that? You know, it's, you know, unfortunately, I
Maybe you should
seldom
have a
do that.
score on the profiles for how many fake stories you shared, and maybe people will stop sharing as
I
much.
don't know.
Thank you.
All right. I think you're next.
Question. My name is Jim Berlant. I'm living in Texas, just back here visiting. You mentioned earlier about the build your own newspaper with the
Yeah.
sites like Feedly. One concern I would have, and I'd like to ask your opinion on how to avoid the potential pitfall, is building your own Fox News or building something, regardless of what your bias is, that you're only going to be getting something within your own epistemically closed set of beliefs.
Well, there's nothing you can do about that, but that's, you know, I mean, that's freedom of the press, you know. And I wrote a paper about Fox News once in which I said that it was essentially self-brainwashing. But this is actually rather important. You see, one of the reasons why conservatives, and let's be honest, it's a problem mainly on the right side of the political spectrum to be so gullible about some of these stories, is because, you know, dating back, some of us here in this room are old enough to remember Spiro Agnew when he gave a speech attacking the media in 1969. I think this is when he said nattering nabobs of negativism. But at that time, the media was in a much more powerful position, and it was, frankly, somewhat more to the left than it is today. Certainly to the left of the Republican Party and Spiro Agnew, and so in all the years since then, I think conservatives just grew up all their lives with a chip on their shoulders about the bias of the media against them, and even once that bias disappeared, the chip on the shoulder was still there, you see. So people talk about the left-wing New York Times, and I say they must be reading a different paper than I'm reading, and things of this sort. But my point is that as a result of this attitude, conservatives have long cultivated an alternative media, long before Rush Limbaugh and Fox News and Breitbart. You know, they were more willing to listen to, you know, little newsletters and things like Human Events and National Review, or the rare major newspaper. I remember the Richmond Times, it was Richmond News Leader, the afternoon newspaper that was even more conservative than the morning paper, and people would subscribe to that. I remember when I was a kid, I lived in Dallas. The Dallas Morning News in those days was a very conservative newspaper. and people would seek out this sort of thing, and learn to trust non-mainstream sources is what I'm trying to get at, and I think that has still come down to the present day.
Just going to make a quick comment, just in the interest of time. I'm going to call these the last 3 questions.
Hi, my reading of your material goes way back to when you were writing editorials for the Wall Street Journal. And a particular interest is tax policy and the scoring, the static and dynamic
You should
scoring.
talk to Pete Davis. He used to do the scoring.
So my question today, there's always, like, you look at a source and you say, well, are they biased in their modeling? And I'm interested in what would you say are the best sources for, especially dynamic scoring. Dynamic scoring takes into account the actual effects on behavior when people respond to the incentives or disincentives provided by a change in tax policy. What would you say are the best models so that you can go to that website? In particular, mention whether you find it useful to go to the Tax Institute, for example, and any other particular sources.
Well, I would say that the Tax Policy Center is, would you agree, is the... Well, but the Tax Foundation is a conservative organization, which does... Okay, well, you know more about that than I do.
So the Tax Foundation...
And the Tax Policy Center.
Not
Those-
the Tax Institute.
No, I mean, there is a place called the Tax Institute, but that's not going to give you any useful information. But see, the problem is that if you feed in a particular GDP growth rate, any model is going to give you the same results. The question is, where did that GDP number come from? And what the administration decided to do is they simply made it up out of thin air. They just said, if the economy grows twice as fast as it's ever grown before, we'll get twice as much revenue as we got.
No, I understand that.
I mean,
but but you do have to feed in some number.
Well, that's true.
But that number is
but look-
partly the effect of the tax policy itself.
Yes, but there's debate about all these things. The Congressional Budget Office, I think most economists would rely upon. They have done any number of studies over the years comparing the growth effects of different policies. They have a book they put out every year on reducing the deficit that often has a lot of data in there about, for example, the impact of a tax increase. Well, these numbers tend to be symmetrical, so you can just change the sign and find out what the model would tell you about a tax cut of the same magnitude. And there's a table in the budget, or at least they used to be, that would tell you, okay, if interest rates are 1% higher over the next 10 years, how much will that add to spending? And there's a lot of back of the envelope kinds of places you can find that kind of data. But in general, I would rely upon the Congressional Budget Office, the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Tax Policy Center, and the Tax Foundation. With the caveat that they are going to, if you've got a range of answers, and this one is good for the Republican Party and this one isn't, this will be their answer. They tend to cherry pick for the benefit of their own philosophical point of view. An honest answer would be, I mean, the honest answer to almost every tax question is I don't know, but nobody gives that answer.
And all of those sources give dynamic scoring.
To some extent. I mean, one of the problems with dynamic scoring is you can only do it every once in a while because you're doing a tax bill that's big enough to affect the macroeconomy. I mean, if a tax bill is only, doing a few $1 billion worth of tax increasing or tax cutting, you're not going to get a dynamic effect. It's just too small. So I mean, how many years has it been since we did a tax cut of the kind we just did? You have to go back at least to the early years of the Bush administration, right? So, you're not going to get the opportunity to even be able to study dynamic scoring except once every, dozen or so years. I would mention, by the way, since the Republicans continue to call their monstrosity tax reform, if you look up an article by Alan Auerbach and Joel Slemrod in the Journal of Economic Literature, 1995, 1996, thereabouts, They did a very, very thorough study of the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which was a big piece of legislation. The corporate tax rate was reduced by 12 percentage points, from 46 to 34%. The top income tax rate was reduced to 28%, much lower even than they've done this time. And they did a big study trying to find out what the economic effects were, and it turned out it was zero. Nothing bad, nothing good. Maybe everything washed. Maybe all the bad stuff in the legislation was compensated for by the good stuff. But the net effect was it had no effect on the economy. All it did was cause people to do a lot of tax planning. And Marty Lobel is around here. He probably remembers doing a lot of work to help his clients. But you can't just assume because a tax bill is a big bill affecting a lot of revenues and a lot of industries that it's going to have a big effect. Sometimes it had no effect at all.
Thank you.
I'm willing to stand up here for a while. I don't want to hold up people, but
I like just a couple of points about newspapers now and then. When I worked on Capitol Hill in the 70s, we used to agree that if we were honest, we'd sit down and we generally believed everything in the New York Times and the Washington Post, except the stuff we were actually directly involved in. Because the facts can be correct, but just the way they're presented can change the meaning. But meanwhile, I don't know quite what you mean by revealing their sources, because newspaper articles aren't generally footnoted, and they may make a reference to a document that's printed in full, but that's fairly rare. So,
well, I'm referring to the current era in which almost everything is available online, and what that eliminated. I mean, it used to be the editors probably spent 90% of their time cutting articles down to fit in the literal amount of space. We got 12 inches for this story, and sometimes they would just cut from the bottom up, and I'm just saying they're not space constrained anymore. They could provide more information, more documentation, or just provide better links to these sources, because I think it's in their own interest to improve the quality of their credibility for the benefit of their skeptical readers. And let's face it, there's a lot of skeptical readers out there. You just mentioned, I know something about this particular story. I was there, and this isn't right. Well, I think people probably have more access to the news because we have 24/7 cable networks, and you can watch that silly woman in the White House give her press briefing every day, and you can watch it from beginning to end without any trouble. It used to be, if you weren't physically in the room, that was the only way you knew what the press secretary said. You had to trust that the reporter is going to tell you what you would have wanted to get out of the briefing if you yourself had been there. That is, they were standing in your place, telling you what they think or hope you would like to know. And now you don't have to do that. You don't have to read somebody's write-up of the press secretary's news conference. You can just watch it. It's on YouTube, And so I'm just saying there's a different dynamic here, and I think the media could help itself get people to trust them more if they would provide more documentation. There's no space constraint to not do so. That's all I'm really saying.
I see. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking tonight. Someone earlier asking a question used the word fabulation, which is a word I personally love, although not necessarily in this context. But I do believe we are such creatures of emotion and storytelling, and I wondered if you had advice for readers on how to demand engaging stories that are still well documented, but we do expect to be engaged and interested, and how do we balance that as readers and as writers?
Well, that's interesting. I suppose in theory, the market kind of takes care of it. I mean, people are, acutely aware of how many clicks their stories get, and presumably they see, oh, geez, this one got way more readers than my last one. What did I say? What did I do that's different? And hopefully they can kind of learn from that. I certainly try to. But the fact is, a lot of it's just luck, you know. You just happen to be there when a story broke, and you were the first one to be able to report it. So you got a lot of links, even if your writing was pretty crappy. Now, one of the things that's, I don't know whether this is still true, but I mean, reporters used to not really even have to be writers. They had what were called rewrite desks. And a reporter would call in and give the basic facts to an editor or a writer who would then do the literal writing. And so I think there's probably a lot of Pulitzer Prizes that were given out over the years to people who didn't literally write the stories. They may have gotten the facts and broken the information and so on, but they didn't do the literal writing. Somebody else who's a much better writer than they are did the actual writing. And so I don't know whether that kind of function can even exist in this era where we don't even have photographers anymore. You know, you have to take your own pictures with your phone, you know, if you want to have some illustration to go along with your story. Everybody has to be a jack of all trades, and now you have to do video too and post that on. And they like video because it keeps more eyeballs on the site, you know, as you watch through this stuff. And I think, you know, being a jack of all trades is fine, but being a specialist is better. And reporters don't have the luxury of being specialists anymore and saying, okay, I'm just covering the House side of Capitol Hill. Now you got to cover both sides. You got to know way more about everything that's going on and so on. And they're spread too thin to do a good job. And the most important thing that's being lost, in my opinion, is investigative reporting, which might take months and months of serious legwork and phone calling and all kinds of stuff that newspapers can't afford to do anymore. They only have so many staff to cover what's happening today. And I think that's bad for society. Okay.
Thank you.
How about one more round of applause for Bruce Bartlett?